survivors from yesterday's seminar, and who come in on Saturday morning. The pyramids of Gaza, so a forensic architect once told me, proliferate throughout the strip, but are most commonly seen in the camps and neighborhood that green Gaza City and along the short border to Egypt. They are the result, he said, of an encounter between two familiar elements in the area: a 3-story residential building, the kind that provides a home for refugees, and an armored Caterpillar D9 bulldozer. While the bulldozer circles the building, its short shovel can reach and topple only the peripheral columns. The internal columns are left intact, forming the peak of the pyramid. The floor slabs break at the approximate center, around the crest, and fall down and outwards to form the faces of the structure. The geometry of the pyramids of Gaza is not as ideal as the pyramid of Giza. The irregularities register differences in the process of construction, the uneven spread of concrete, for example, or in the process of destruction, the inability or reluctance of a bulldozer operator to go completely around the building. Sometimes the irregularity is a result of a previous firefight or a tank shell shot at the corner of the building to hasten the departure of its inhabitants. For several years I was dealing with architecture, not as a projective design practice, but as a diagnostic technique. The diagnostic of war crime and human rights violation. I will later show you some of these. Reading architecture, reading history and political force fields as they are registered in it, I have realized, is more complicated than I initially thought. It needs not only the use of architectural language, but for the reading to have political effect and affect, it needs spaces to resonate in. The reading needs spaces to resonate in institutional framework. Let's call these resonating chambers forums. So this is forensics, the ancient art of the forum. Forensics, of course, comes from the Latin forum. It includes the way in which things, in our case architecture, is coming to speak. Forensics is part of rhetorics, and rhetorics is about speech. But not only that of humans, not only the speech of people, but the strange and obscure speech of things. So things speak through the technologies and protocols of forensics. Forensics need 3 things. And you will see that in all the examples and stories I will tell today, there's always an interaction, overlaps between those 3 following things. An object, right? An interpreter, somebody who speaks on behalf of the object, and a forum. The interpreter was the rhetorician, and in today's forum, it is the expert witness. He uses science as a tool of persuasion, right? So the forensics is not about the scientific investigation, it's about the presentation of science. Science as a means of persuasion. Which means that, and I hope you will accept, there is an aesthetic consideration involved in forensics. This is what we call the forensic aesthetics. Which is, of course, a complex field of appearances and interpretation, or interpretation of the sensible, as a contemporary philosopher put it. So I'd like to think about the forums in which those interpretations take place, or the relation between 2 spaces. The space interpreted, like those pyramids, right? I offered you an interpretation of them. interpretation itself. I mean, where does this reading take place? And how does this reading acquire political power or effect? Does it? This, by the way, is the premise of the project Forensic Architecture. One that both reads architecture and constructs the forum in which the reading of architecture could matter. Right? You have to work on those two lines. If you think so, even if you want to be, what I say, kind of an architect involved in architecture diagnostic technique, you need to offer a reading of architecture and show how history of political forces folded into this thing. And you need to construct the spaces where that interpretation will take place. So here is a sort of a debased example. Whether in Iran, in Darfur, or in other places, the inability or lack of enthusiasm to enter a place, to speak to witnesses, to people, means we rely more and more on satellite imagery. And what is registered in satellite imagery are buildings. Right? In these places where we cannot enter, or don't have to decide to, it's too complicated, buildings become the depository of political events and political intentions. We think we know that Iran wants to build nuclear capacity because the buildings are where they are and earthwork is being seen. So forensics in that sense is the archaeology of the very recent past. But as I said before, it's also a projective practice engaged with constructing new forms to come. Forms are not fixed, even if they are sometimes consolidated within fixed architectural structures. They are dynamic and contingent, temporary, diffused, and networked by new technology and the media. They emerge around found evidence, they expand, transform, sometimes combine with other forms, while at other times they simply come apart, burst, unravel before us. So here is, I promise, a debased example, and it is obviously the kind of the place where the reading takes place, right? The Security Council and the reading of both Adlai Stevenson and Colin Powell of respective non-conventional build-ups in Cuba or in Iraq. And of course the aerial photographs and the kind of archaeological reading of damage that occurred early yesterday. A mysterious blast in one of Iran's facilities is read, and the politics and meaning of that within a kind of technological process of constructing, splitting the atom, and geopolitics, right? And how a kind of a reading of that is occurring through an interpretation of rubble rather than the witness. To get to the point I aim at, in fact, I have to take a detour through bones, and you had a lot of bones yesterday, and I hope you can bear with me as I go through mine. Another field, that of anthropology, of forensic anthropology. So let's start with bones, and with a piece of work that I've done with the writer Thomas Keenan, a New York-based academic and a friend of mine on them. This is Clyde Snow presenting a witness, a very special kind of witness, in the Argentine trials of the junta leaders in the middle of the 80s. Within the field of war crime investigation, a methodological shift has recently led to a certain blurring. The primacy according to the witness and to the subjective and linguistic dimension of testimony, trauma, and memory, a primacy that had such an enormous cultural, aesthetic, and political influence that has reframed the end of the 20th century as, quote, the era of the witness, is gradually being supplemented, let us not say bypassed, by an emergent forensic aesthetics and object-oriented juridical culture, immersed in matter and materialities, in code and form, and in the presentation of scientific investigations by experts. The trials of the Argentine junta, from which this image is taken, and the exhumation and identification of the disappeared in a context, are referred to by most literature on the emergence of forensics in war crime investigation. Now, war crime investigation and human rights, you must know, is a field that is otherwise very committed to witness testimony, both the testimony of victims and perpetrators, in which, to a certain extent, one could say that the status of testimony, human testimony, is known not only epistemic, i.e., it's not only about the knowledge, the information, the data that is conveyed, but it's an ethical political gesture, right? So human rights organizations, in fact, formed with a kind of a liberal ideology of taking the side of the individual against a repressive regime, right? And therefore the voice, the very voice of the individual has a value which is always in excess of what is being said, right? So we see a kind of transformation, no? With the very field that was conceived to enter into contemporary conflict, its intervention in contemporary conflict, that of moderation, is now, that is so committed to testimony, is now shifting slightly towards matters, objects, materialities. The man who trained a group of forensic anthropologists in Argentina, Clive Snow, is one of the great grave diggers of the 20th century. In fact, I think he is the greatest of all grave diggers. And I would defend this. But you see, there is, at the end of the 20th century, there emerged those heroic grave diggers, right, who transform the field completely, go from places to places, they dig bones, and they speak on their behalf. So Snow is a kind of a Hamlet-like figure. And he's rarely, you cannot find, if you Google his name on the internet, you can rarely find a picture of him without a skull in his hand. You know? So he is speaking through the skull, kind of like a ventriloquist would have a little dummy. Right? He called his work on identifying human remains osteobiography. That is, of course, the biography of bones. I think one yesterday spoke about the biographies of objects. Osteobiography is the biography of bones. By referring to biography, there is more than the moment of death that is here in discussion. The terminal moment where the object changes state, but a long process of life. A sequence of illnesses, incidents and accidents, migration and labor relations that are literally fossilized into the morphology and texture of the bones, right? Even in the word to fossilize, not to turn into, process into form, right? Process into texture and form. With time, relation, association, labor conditions that become texture and form. That's really the key, I think, to understand. To the untrained eye, bones look similar. Skulls are devoid of the expression and gestures of the human face. But the bones of the skeleton are exposed to life in a similar way that photographic film is exposed to light. Life understood as an extended set of exposure to a myriad of forces, which I mentioned, labor, location, nutrition, violence, and so on, is projected onto a mutating, growing and contracting negative, which is the body.